If you're familiar with Aragorn's lineage, you know that he can trace it back thousands of years. He's of the Dunedain of Arnor, but before that, the Dunedain were the Númenóreans, and before they were the Númenóreans, they were the Edain. Although they evolved and went through highs and lows, there is continuity from the first Edain to the last of the Dunedain. Not all groups are so lucky. Throughout Middle-earth's long history, some groups perished entirely, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the extinct peoples of Middle-earth. Perhaps the first group to go extinct in its entirety were the Petty Dwarves. The Petty Dwarves were an unofficial 8th clan of dwarves, made up of individuals from other dwarven clans that had been exiled, usually for being of ill nature. They were the first dwarves to cross into Beleriand, making crude dwellings at places such as Amon Rud or the Caves of Nargothrond, or as the Petty Dwarves called them, Sharbund and Nulakizdin. Perhaps owing to their dark origins, the Petty Dwarves only regressed from normal dwarves, becoming smaller and far less sociable, prone to deeds such as murder and betrayal. This had dire consequences for the Petty Dwarves, for when they first encountered the Sindarin elves of Beleriand, the Sindar believed that they were animals and hunted them. Honestly, not a great look for the Sindar. Although the Sindar realised their mistake upon meeting the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains, a great amount of damage had been done to the Petty Dwarves, but they also did not help their own cause. When the Noldor arrived, the Petty Dwarves helped Finrod Felagund build Nargothrond in exchange for a reward, but then their chieftain, Mim, attempted to murder Finrod in his sleep, and as a result the Petty Dwarves were expelled. They relocated to Amon Rud, which could house no more than 100, and there the Petty Dwarves continued to dwindle. By 486 of the First Age, only 3 known individuals remained, Mim and his 2 sons, Kim and Ibun. They encountered Turin Tarambar's outlaw band, and Kim was unfortunately killed in their first meeting. Ibun and Mim lived with the outlaws for 3 years, and although the tales differ, Ibun was captured by orcs and Mim agreed to guide the orcs to Turin's secret stronghold in order to save his son's life. We're unsure if this saved Ibun, but regardless, he did not live for much longer. In 502, Hurin encounters Mim in the ruins of Nargothrond, and Mim claims to be the last of his people, implying that Ibun has since died. Aware of Mim's part in the betrayal of his son, Hurin shows no mercy to Mim and kills him. As they do not appear again, this is assumed to be the end of the Petty Dwarves. Another group that seems to have went extinct in the First Age are the Easterlings of Bor. In 463, the first Easterlings crossed into Beleriand. They were made up of many different tribes and houses, but the 2 greatest houses were those of Ulfang and Bor. Both leaders swore fealty to the House of Feanor, who were desperate for more manpower in the war against Morgoth. Bor swore fealty to Maedhros and Maglor, and his people dwelt around Maglor's Gap, whereas Ulfang and his people swore fealty to Caranthir and probably end up dwelling in Thargelion. The main difference between the 2 tribes became apparent during the Nenea Unoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. As the battle reached its climax, the Easterlings of Ulfang switched sides, revealing that they were actually in Morgoth's service. The Easterlings of Bor remained faithful to the Feanorians, but it was to no avail. Maedhros' army disintegrated, and Morgoth would win a decisive victory. Bor and all 3 of his sons perished in the battle, but they were able to kill Ulfang's 2 younger sons. The eldest fell at the hands of Maglor. After this, the Easterlings of Bor are not mentioned again, and we really don't know what happened to them. In some of Tolkien's drafts, Easterling outlaws are mentioned in part of Turin's band, suggesting that they may have been of the House of Bor, but that is soon removed. The Easterlings who served Morgoth would end up dwelling in Hiflum, where they oppressed the remaining Edain. If some of the Easterlings of Bor survived, they may have been reduced to thraldom there as well. No Easterlings are mentioned as fighting against Morgoth during the War of Wrath. This all points towards the grim possibility that after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the House of Bor was simply slaughtered for their faithfulness to the Noldor or became so absorbed into the other Easterlings that they ceased to exist as their own people. But while the Easterlings of Bor and Beleriand were probably wiped out, they did have cousins who remained in Eriador, who dwelt in the north of the region and were described as tillers of the earth. There's a possibility that they may have been related to, or were the ancestors of our next 2 groups who were also wiped out, who I'm covering at once. I'm speaking of the Men of Angmar and the Hillmen of Rudaur. We genuinely don't know the origins of these 2 groups, but it's commonly theorized that they were either related to the Gwytherim or the aforementioned Easterlings of Bor. Regardless of their mysterious origins, the Men of Angmar, referred to as the Men of Carn Dûm, were some of the Witch King's primary servants in his wars against Arnor, They dwelt not just in Angmar, but also in the upper vales of Anduin on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains. The Hallimar of Rudaur dwelt in the hills of the Troll Shores, and were subjects of the Dunedain of Arnor and then of the successor kingdom of Rudaur. They didn't really get along with the Dunedain, and after they eventually secretly aligned themselves with Angmar, they seized power in Rudaur, ousting the weakened Dunedain. They were taught sorcery by the men of Angmar, and the hills, forests, and castles of Rudaur became dark places. In the end, seemingly neither group would survive the destruction of Angmar. When Angmar was destroyed, it was said not a man or orc of that people remained west of the mountains, and even those remnants east of the Misty Mountains lasted only 3 years longer, being driven off by the Aethiod. Given that Angmar did not rise again, it seems the destruction was fairly thorough. The Hillmen of Rudaur seem to have gotten the same treatment. They're not mentioned again, and during the War of the Ring, Aragorn mentions that the lands have been empty for many years. Our next group had the most unsettling extinction. I'm speaking of the Men of the Mountains, who would become the Dead Men of Dunharrow, or the Oathbreakers. The Men of the Mountains were pre-Númenóreans, men related to the Halladin, who could be found living between the rivers Anduin and Greyflood through the First and Second Ages. During the Second Age, many of these men unfortunately ended up serving Sauron to differing degrees, and as a result, they were not treated well by the Númenórean colonizers. The Men of the Mountains, however, dwelt further inland and were a force to be reckoned with. When Gondor was founded, Isildur wanted to make use of their power and made them swear an oath that, should Sauron return, they would fight against him. But when the War of the Last Alliance started, the Men of the Mountains forswore their oath and confirmed their allegiance to Sauron. They did not fight for him though, as Isildur cursed them to eternal unrest, and being afraid of his wrath, they fled into the mountains and took no part in the war. There they remained, hiding in dark places, and when they died, their spirits remained bound to the world, eternal unrest as wraiths. This extinction did not happen quickly. In fact, the Men of the Mountains remained for thousands of more years, slowly dwindling away. They are said to have still existed by 1981, described as being unfriendly to outsiders. Not long after the founding of Rohan in 2510, there were still some men who remained alive. King Brago and his son, Baldur, witnessed one die outside the Paths of the Dead. Not long afterwards, Baldur goes to explore the Paths and is attacked and killed by living men. But by the War of the Ring, the Men of the Mountains seem to be fully extinct, as Aragorn and the Grey Company do not encounter a living person. They do end up fulfilling their oath, and Aragorn releases them from undeath. But yeah, a grim fate regardless. Our last group has a most mysterious fate, and we're not entirely sure whether they're actually extinct. I'm referring to the Stores of the Wilderland, or to explain it a little more, the hobbits who dwelt in the Vales of Anduin, of whom Smeagol came from. At one point in history, the hobbits were split into 3 major groups that could all be found east of the Misty Mountains: the Harfoots, the Fallowhides, and the Stores. By 1200 of the Third Age, all 3 groups had migrated over the Misty Mountains into Eriador, and were dwelling in the eastern parts of that region. When Angmar became active, they gradually moved westwards, and by the middle of the 17th century, hobbits of all 3 kinds could be found living in Breland and the Shire. Not all hobbits though. When Angmar became active, a group of Stores took their chances and moved back over the Misty Mountains to the Vales of Anduin, specifically around the Gladden Fields. This group survived until at least the end of the 25th century, because that's when Deagol found the One Ring and was murdered by Smeagol. After that, we don't hear from them again, and actually there's a passage in the Hunt for the Ring which is a little ominous, saying that when the Nazgul were searching for the Shire, they did travel north up the Vales of Anduin and found the remnants of old Store villages long abandoned. So what happened to the Stores of the Wilderland? It's possible that they also moved to the Shire, but given the hobbits kept pretty good records and that there's no mention of this, it seems unlikely. Unfortunately, it seems like they may have met their end through violence, because their last mention is right around the time when Sauron returned to Dol Guldur, ending the Watchful Peace. Following that, there were periods where the Vales of Anduin were extremely unsafe. There were orcs in the mountains, Sauron's creatures in Dol Guldur, and even Easterlings raiding up to the Gladden Fields. It's certainly possible that the poor Stores of the Wilderland dwindled and then met their end at the hands of one of these threats. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. Honestly, as I wrote the last bit of this script about the Stores of the Wilderland, I asked myself the question why I have not done a Middle-earth Mysteries video about them yet. so you can definitely expect that in the future. I guess it's just like hobbits to escape notice. If you think I've missed any groups or have any theories about them, write those answers down in the comments. Cheers, farewell, and if you want to avoid extinction, just don't die. I don't know, how hard is it?